Most of us would have been peasants in the medieval period. What was an ordinary day's work like for an ordinary peasant? Let's find out. About 90 to 95% of the population of medieval England were peasants. Now, peasant really just means somebody that works the land, small-scale farmers, mid-scale farmers, that kind of thing. But basically, the bulk of us were ordinary working small-time farmers, in effect. The whole bunch of different levels of status within that broad category. I know today peasant tends to mean somebody who's uneducated, unsophisticated, and perhaps that was the case then, but broadly speaking, everybody was fairly unsophisticated and fairly uneducated, unless you were the small minority of nobility or specialist jobs like monk, scrivener, whatever it might be, magistrate, whatever it might be. There were specialist jobs, but they were a tiny minority of the population. So chances are you lived in a small village with 100, 150 friends, relations, extended family members, and your ordinary day was not that dissimilar to the days of an ordinary worker in many ways. The word peasant encompasses a vast group of people. Some were serfs, indentured servants in many ways. They had rights, they had land, but they owned the land they worked the land they lived on behalf of the Lord of the Manor. Now, the Lord of the Manor also had obligations to them, so it's quite complex. It's the feudal system, but there were different levels. So some peasants were quite poor, genuinely quite poor by the standards of the day. There weren't technically slaves at this stage as such, so the lowest of the low were serfs, and they had to work roughly 3 days a week for the Lord of the Manor, more during the harvest and specific times of the day when the Lord of the Manor needed things to be done. As you go up the social hierarchy, you still remain within the broad category of peasant, but you have villeins, cotters, sokemen, who are relatively increasing levels of freedom, to the point where you get free men who genuinely are individuals that do not owe allegiance to a Lord of the Manor. They may pay rent in terms of actual money instead of service. It depends on the time of history, depends on the geographical location, of course. But there were people who were what we might determine as sort of individual citizens as such. Again, though the concept of being a citizen was not something that would have been familiar to the medieval person, you owed allegiance to the king, effectively. And that king might be king of England and parts of France and Normandy. And it got complicated, basically, but most people knew they had to pay taxes, they had to work for the Lord of the Manor, and that's what they did in an average day. Most people lived in medieval villages, and a medieval village was a cluster of housing. We would think of them as a little bit like huts in a way. They would vary from very modest one-room shelters with a central hearth to slightly bigger places, but not much more than that. It's unlikely they would be more than 1 story high. There's just no reason you could go backwards into your strip of land behind your property if you needed more space. And most people were outside all the time, and there wasn't much to do when you were inside because it was dark. So it was really for keeping hold of things, keeping it relatively safe, a place to shelter from the bad weather, keep warm, and a place to sleep. Most people worked outside. They would be outside from dawn to dusk. The village itself would be clustered around maybe a crossroads, maybe a stream or river. Decent water source was very important. You would probably drink water, but not perhaps from the river, because rivers are often quite polluted, but from a well or from a spring where you could be fairly confident that no animal had died in it, nobody was dropping their waste, and it wasn't contaminated. People were well aware that bad water would make you ill. You would have a cluster of 30, 40 houses, and on the outside of that, there'd possibly be a church as well, a church or a chapel of various different sizes, depending on the exact time period. And on the outside of that, you'd have the roads out. The roads would go out to what were called great fields. These would be big areas of fields divided into long strips, and each person worked a strip of land. I'll go into the actual dimensions and sizes of that later. But the landscape, unlike modern England, the landscape was probably fairly open. There wouldn't have been hedges as such as the way we understand them today. There would have been coppices and spinneys. There would have been, the woodland, because that was an important resource as well. But these great fields were quite big. They would encompass hundreds of acres sometimes, and there were usually 3 of them, and they were managed in rotation. That's the idealized situation. Sometimes there were more. There were areas of common ground as well. There were even areas of what's known as waste. Now, wasteland conjures up images of destroyed landscapes, but that's not the case. Waste in the medieval period just means knocked down to agriculture and not really used. So it was a term used in the Domesday Book to describe land that possibly could be brought into cultivation, but actually isn't at the moment. It's just slightly wild, I suppose, possibly overgrown with brambles or whatever it might be, or gorse, whatever the local vegetation was. Quite a useful resource, though, for wildlife, potentially. Most of a peasant's life revolved around working the land and perhaps one day a week going to the local market to stock up on essential goods they couldn't make for themselves. It was a fairly quiet and gentle life most of the time. So when did the day begin? Well, usually it began with people waking up roughly around sunrise. The medieval lifestyle revolved around daylight. You would get up early in the morning, I suppose. Naturally, you don't have alarm clocks, but the light is coming in through windows with no glass in them. And the landscape is starting to wake up as well. People lived with a lot more animals than we do today. I've got 17 horses, and in the morning I can hear them getting ready for their morning food, turn out, their exercise and that kind of thing. Medieval people would have been the same. There would have been a lot of animals. Everybody, well, most people kept pigs, kept 1 or 2 domestic pigs. There would be cows, there would be the odd horse, there'd be mules, there'd be cockerels, there'd be chickens, all sorts of things in the landscape. Those animals tend to wake up at dawn and start to make a noise. So if you are used to the sound of your environment and attuned to it, your body is going to wake you up at roughly that time. So everybody's going to start getting up, yawning, rubbing the sleep from their eyes first thing in the morning, flinging clothes off. People tended to sleep in linen underclothes, but now they wash. Most people feel that medieval people didn't wash. They did. They didn't have showers, obviously. They didn't have warm baths, obviously. It's expensive to heat water. But you can heat a bowl of water, or you can just rinse with a cloth in a jug, bowl of water. You rinse your face, you take the cloth, dampen it down, wipe your armpits and your nethers, freshen yourself up for the day. You don't have a shower as such, you don't have a bath, but you do wash. You wash all the important places with that cloth, wring that cloth out, put the water on the little herb garden outside your house, a bit of watering. Don't want to waste that because water's heavy, takes a lot of time to carry it around, a very big part of the day. Don't waste it, put it on the plants, but it's cleaned you. You've got a cleaner face for the morning. Brushing teeth, well, possibly. Toothbrushes, probably not. You'd use a twig, possibly your finger, swill your mouth out, spit, blow your nose, do all those things we do in private, though, that you don't talk about, just to get yourself ready for the day, really. And put your clothes on and go through the door to greet the morning light, and all your fellow peasants also getting up, moaning, groaning, grumbling that they've got to go and do a day's work perhaps, and then head off into the fields to your designated task of the day. Given the prevalence of the church as well, and the awareness of gentle religiousness, I think, at this period, I think it's possible that people said a quick morning prayer, partly reflexively, partly genuinely out of piety. Probably something just quick, hoping for a good harvest or great weather or whatever it might be, or good health. Much like people do today in some parts of the world and in some cultures. They say a prayer in the morning or say thank you over breakfast. Now, breakfast is an interesting one. It's unlikely that ordinary people baked bread every day, in my opinion. Some types of peasant bread, very heavy, they're rye, mostly a rye bread, so a bit like sort of German black bread that you can buy today, artisan. They're very heavy, they do last longer than the more expensive wheat breads that we're used to today. So it's possible you just have a slice of your 2-day-old bread and a mug of ale or fresh water as your breakfast, maybe some cheese, apple, all the things that are available. Possibly you won't cook, although it is possible you might quickly stir the fire, get it going and vaguely heat up some pottage left over, maybe put some more ingredients in it. I think it would depend on, you know, how much time and effort you wanted to put into your breakfast. Typically breakfast was the bigger meal of the day though, and the midday meal was smaller and then the evening meal even smaller. So they ate in a slightly different way to much of the Western world, where breakfast tends to be smaller and then the evening meal is the biggest. But peasants typically had a bigger breakfast. Now that might eat into some of the very early morning components. So some people have suggested they got up in the dark to cook breakfast, but I think ordinary people probably wouldn't do that. We all need our sleep. So I guess the average person would get up at around dawn, sort their own breakfast out. Their household would sort their breakfast out. Most people were in a partnership, maybe with children as well, and get ready for the day ahead. So how would you go to the toilet? Well, most people had a chamber pot under their bed. Even in medieval times, you would have that chamber pot. So your fluids would go into that. You might carry that out to a barrel, pour that in. It would mix with the rest of the urine that was aging, because that could be used for washing, and you're not going to throw away that kind of resource. So you'd tip the fluids in there. If you needed to do solids, well, there were privies. They were typically holes in the ground, a long drop potentially with a bench seat over the top of it. Solids would go into that. Maybe some sawdust sprinkled over the top, some hay. That was also a valuable resource. That would have been dug out regularly and spread on the landscape, as it is in much of the world today. You can't afford to waste any kind of nutrient when you're living off the land like this. So solids and liquids collected, not flushed away as we do today. Now, one of the other things that might be part of the morning ritual is you get up, brush your teeth, wash a little bit, put your clothes on, stagger outside to do those little tasks that you've got to do. Check the animals are all secured, maybe pull up some food for breakfast. But you do a few, like modern farmers do today, like I do today before breakfast. I go out to do the first tasks of a busy day, your local tasks. You do those, check chickens, feed them, check the pigs okay, give the pigs some food, just have a quick look around, check everything's all right and verify nothing bad has happened over the night. And then you go back in for your breakfast. So I think you'd probably pop out, do a few little tasks, come back in, have breakfast, get yourself ready for the big day's work. After breakfast, take a packed lunch. That's a possibility, wrapped up in some wax cloth that you take with you, depending on the seasons. And off you go, leaving the house, trudging up the road for 5-10 minutes, walking, commuting to your designated field of work. So the main work begins. Men would have travelled out to the particular part of the landscape that they were working in. Now, the medieval system, the feudal system, revolved around these 3 great fields. So every village of any significance would have 3 great fields. You would work a piece of that field. It wouldn't be the whole field. It would be what's called a strip, an agricultural strip of land. These were a very important component of the medieval sort of working structure, if you like. You had a strip of land to work, and that was the bit that was yours and very clearly delineated. These were 22 yards a chain by a furlong, 220 yards. So roughly 1/10 strip of land. Now, the land shape comes from, in particular, the difficulty of turning around things like medieval ploughs. It's much easier once you're going to keep going in a straight line for a long time than travel a bit, turn around, come back again. So the concept of an acre, which is a strip of land 22 yards by 220 yards long, is also the concept of a day's work. So an agricultural labourer would be expected to complete that much work in a working day. Now, I presume there was different types of soil, just as there are today, heavier soil, lighter soil. And so some was difficult to plough, for example, some was relatively easy to plough, depends on the weather and the soil and all that kind of stuff. But as a general marker of the amount of work that one agricultural person with a team of oxen is supposed to do is an ox gang can plough an acre in a day. And that was a strip, and that was a structural piece of the landscape that everybody would understand. Now, interestingly, those dimensions tie in with other things in an interesting way potentially as well. So, for example, longbow practice would take place over about 220 yards. And I think that's potentially linked to the fact that you'd be at one end of the strip, you'd put the target at the other end of the strip, and 220 yards is a fairly long shot for a longbow, but, you know, it's doable. And that was convenient, and it sort of fitted in with everything else. Not sure whether that's true or not, but it does strike me as a bit of a coincidence. You'll see in the landscape that these still exist. Some of these strips of land, these open field systems still exist. There's a wonderful place in England called Laxton, and that still has this three great field structure. Now, these fields would not be enclosed like you would see today, for example. So the hedgerows that we all love, are a relatively modern invention, part of the enclosures, much after the medieval period. So the medieval landscape would have been much more open, and you would be able to see your fellows working in the fields as well. They're plodding up and down, you're plodding up and down. A lot of the strips took on this lazy S, this very long S. And the reason for that is you're ploughing in one direction, you then got the struggle to get the ruddy oxen turned around, and they're not the easiest of animals to manage. They're sort of fairly stubborn and just do their job. You've got to lift the plough out of the ground, manhandle it around, get it back in and plough back the other way. So you're going to leave lots of bits of earth up on the headland, and we see that in the record. You can see it in Google Maps sometimes. You can see extra lumps of land and soil where over the decades bits of soil falling off the plough have increased the height of one particular area. And then you see this long S in the landscape. Not far from where I live, there are things that you can still see. They're protected by law as well. They're protected by various rules, because they are not historical monuments in a way, but they are historical. They should be. They're monuments to the ordinary agricultural life of our ancestors. Now, what were women doing? Well, women would be doing largely household jobs outside of harvest time. In harvest time, they also got involved. They got involved in tying the sheaves together and carrying and fetching and all sorts of things like that. Wouldn't necessarily do as many of the headline, whatever you want to call it, the headline jobs like the actual scything or the actual ploughing, although I'm pretty sure some of them did, well, they had to. But of course they would run the household, so they would be fetching and carrying water. That is hard work. They would be attending the little garden just outside their home, because there weren't so much spices, but there were flavourings. So you can grow onions, you can grow sage and thyme, mint. Mint grows on its own, actually, as every gardener knows. It's pretty much hard to get rid of, but it's still quite tasty. It makes a really nice tisane, a nice tea. And so does pine, actually. Pine needles, nettle and mint tea is actually really nice, and you can just grab it from the landscape sometimes. Make sure you're getting it from a clean source. You don't want anything that a dog's peed on, of course. So just be a bit careful. But broadly speaking, women were just as busy, if not more busy, than men, and children. So you had a lot of children in the landscape too. Most people had 2, 3, 4 children. They wouldn't be going to school in the same way that people might in the West. They would be at foot. As soon as they're capable of doing small jobs like feeding the chickens or gathering this or that, they would probably expected, well, not probably, they were expected to chip in. There wasn't this concept of children being allowed to get away with it. They'd obviously go and play, but they would have jobs to do. And there wasn't really the concept of teenagerness. You were either a child or you were a young adult, and you would be expected to do what adults do, expected to behave like an adult as well, perhaps. Seems a bit harsh, but that's what everybody would have expected. So women were doing just as much physical work as the men, slightly different, but it would depend on the time of year. One of the key jobs done by women was washing. That was always on a set day. The community would wash on the same day, usually a Monday, the day after going to church, and usually in some kind of communal situation. So I imagine it was a bit of a get-together, really. Everybody could have a natter and a chat about things. You needed running water. You could use a little bit of lye from ash, perhaps. One of the likely washing ingredients, though, was aged urine. Remember that pot of wee you put aside? Well, you'd save that up for the week. You'd take that down. You'd soak your clothes in it because the ammonia would have a bleaching effect. You'd rinse them thoroughly. You'd bash them against rocks or whatever it was doing. You'd use quite a lot of physical strength. So it was a physically demanding job to wash everything, rinse it all out, spread it out on the ground. There's nothing wrong with putting linen directly on the clean ground. You don't put it on mud, obviously. You drape it over bushes, you put it on foliage to dry, and it will dry quite quickly depending on the time of the year. Of course, if it's raining, you don't have much luck there, but if it's during the summer, it's going to dry very quickly. It's also going to bleach slightly in the sunlight, and that's going to help whiten the linen. Linen often wasn't bleached itself, so it has a slightly darker natural colour, but it's likely that as it was washed and as it was repeatedly cleaned in ammonia and bleached in the sun, it would actually start to take on a brighter white look. And I imagine there was a certain amount of pride in how white you could get your linens, just as there is today, perhaps. I think it's likely that around midday everybody would break. They would break for the midday meal, which was called dinner at that time. Where I come from, dinner is the evening meal, but that's because language has changed and meanings have changed. In a lot of other places, as you go further north in England, in particular, dinner is the midday, the designation, the name of the midday meal. In the medieval period, dinner was midday, and this would be taken in the field if it was harvest time. The women and children would bring out food for people working. Of course, there were women working as well, so whoever wasn't working would bring the food out, and drink as well. Drink was really important, so there'd be lots of ale flowing and lots of water during the harvest. But in an ordinary day, you might just walk back home because you weren't walking very far. You're probably walking a few hundred yards, 300 yards to get back home. So you'd sit down, chill out for a bit and have a meal. And the meals were likely very similar to what people had for lunch. It might be bread and possibly some pottage had been prepared. It's more likely heated food was available at the midday meal because there's time for the fire, and the fire is needed for other things as well. So pottage made of mostly peas, barley, fluids, a little bit of meat juice if you had any, but possibly not. Pork. People had pork in certain seasons, usually in the winter. But you had a reasonable meal and rested for a little bit, got your energy back, and then after that you would go back out to the fields. Is it possible people did foraging as well? Did people forage for wild foods? Well, the Trotula texts in the 12th century talk about people using wild herbs like fennel and plantain and yarrow for healing. Now, whether that was widely known by ordinary people, I don't know, but I have a suspicion that people would know what you could eat from the wild landscape. So nettles, for example, and mint, as I've said before. These were all well known and probably not talked about very much. You just go out and get them from the local area. Mushrooms, of course, in the right season, they wouldn't keep necessarily. But I think there was a certain amount of foraging. Sloe berries, for example, or wild damsons would have existed and would have supplemented the meal. They probably weren't very sweet, though. But because sugar was pretty much reserved for the very wealthy or for very special occasions, everybody was used to a more savoury diet. So anything vaguely sweet would probably feel like it was very sweet to their sort of taste buds, if you like. And honey was available, but again, expensive, probably not for the ordinary person. But you know, it could have been used if you were one of the wealthier peasantry. Maybe you had honey on your bread, possibly butter as well, local butter made locally. And yes, it was a fairly varied diet, but it would depend on the season as well, because food was seasonal. Today we're spoilt by international imports and exports from around the world. So you can get strawberries more or less whenever you want to, because they're grown somewhere now, and you can get them. They're probably vary in price because they've come from further away, but of course if you wanted strawberries back in the medieval period, they're only available for a few weeks if you were lucky. But then they become special because having something once a year makes it a special event, and you would look forward to strawberry season perhaps. I don't know. Yes, so the midday meal is very much a break, sitting down somewhere, maybe on a rock like this, pondering and resting and looking forward to what you had to do for the afternoon. I had a thought the other day about peasants eating meat, and I realised that poaching went on quite a lot because there were laws against it. So if you got caught, you got into trouble, but maybe people didn't get caught that much. And I suddenly thought most of the people writing these records down were from the clergy. And if you asked a peasant what he was eating, because you wanted to write it down, the peasant might be canny enough to go, oh, peas and turnips, just like always, and barley. Okay, but in hiding, he's got a haunch of venison or a brace of rabbits or whatever it might be. But he's not going to tell the people writing it down because A, they're from the church, and B, he doesn't want to get into trouble. So I'm a bit suspicious that in certain places anyway, certainly places further afield, perhaps away from major centres, there was probably a little bit more wild game eaten than might be talked about in the records. It's not that difficult after all to go out and put snares out for rabbits or to catch duck on the local field with a sling, especially if you've trained with a sling from being a small boy. You'd probably be very accurate with it, so you could get that. So I have a suspicion, and it's completely unfounded in the written record, but I have a suspicion that peasants probably snuck in a bit more meat than you might think. Anyway, that's what I like to imagine. Who knows? If you've got any evidence of that, let me know. But I think people are people, aren't they? They do quite like their meat sometimes, and if you could go poaching, maybe you would. The food you got was important though, and after the Black Death in around 1351, there was a statute put out that said no labourer shall be given better food than before, which was an attempt to control the quality of food given to somebody who was working for the Lord of the Manor. I mean, it seems weird to me to do that, but obviously people were persuading labourers who are now in short supply because everybody had died in the Black Death. They were paying them better wages and they were offering them better food, which I think is an interesting observation. Those laws were widely ignored for obvious reasons. You know, if somebody can get better food, well, they're going to wander over there and get better food. And what's anybody going to do about it? There aren't that many people left alive, so you need your work done. So it's interesting that statutory labour has tried to control the quality of food and the quality and the amount of pay for peasant labourers. Yeah, so that was really the beginning of, I guess, people realising their value and realising they could get better conditions and a little bit more pay. So the Black Death, if you survived it, probably brought around a lot of societal changes, a lot of changes in what you expected as a peasant too. So you've finished your dinner break and you wander back out to the fields, or if you're in harvest time, you get up again and you'll go back to work. But mostly you'd go back from your village, back out into the strip that you're going to be ploughing or working in general, weeding. Weeding was a big thing as well at certain times of the year, and finish your day's labour. You would typically finish around sunset-ish. Now, I've been told, and all the research indicates, that people work from dawn to dusk. I suspect there was a certain amount of flexibility there. You know, you'd see that the sun was falling, you've done your work, on the home. Why not? You haven't got anything else to do. You're not going to hang around. You don't have clocking in or clocking out. There's probably nobody supervising you as such. So as long as you get the work done, and you know it's close enough to sunset for you to wander back as the sun is falling back to the village, it must have been quite a nice time. You feel physically, you've done a physical day's work. You're probably quite tired, looking forward to the rest, and off you wander with your tools on your back, that short walk all the way back to your village, where you're looking forward to the evening's entertainment, because there would have been a bit of entertainment, maybe a little bit of a social gathering as the night falls and before everybody wants to go to bed. It's a good time of the day, actually, the early evening, and people socialised a lot more than you might think. It's the evening, and of course in towns and cities there were inns and taverns and various places where you could go and socialise. In villages, which is where most of us lived, of course there weren't often inns or taverns. There might have been an alehouse, so that was one area. There's also a possibility of people meeting in churchyards and gambling and playing dice and getting rowdy. We know that after Sunday Mass, people sometimes got into trouble by the raucous behaviour in the churchyard. So Ely, for example, in the 13th century, men were punished for unseemly and unruly behaviour in the churchyard after service. So people were aware of rowdy behaviour. However, I think it's likely that most of the time people were tired after the day's work. They wanted to chat, they wanted to maybe share gossip. If somebody's been to the market, maybe they picked up some information and want to spread that information around and share a confidence perhaps. Or really talk about speculation. Who's the new king? What's going on here? Is there an invasion in the south? Probably not. But I imagine rumours flew around much like social media does today. People would have been quietly drinking ale. Ale was a very important kind of food substance as well. It's people talk about it being liquid bread, had a lot of calories in it, and it wasn't particularly alcoholic. There were no spirits that were drunk of an evening either. So you had water, you had ale, you just sat and chilled out really around a fire, around the natural forms of artificial light, if you like, not electricity, not anything like that, but rushlights in particular, candles, which were a little more expensive. They were manageable if you were reasonably wealthy. You could have a candle or two. And obviously the upper echelons had plenty of beeswax candles, so did the church. But ordinary people probably made do with rushlights just to light their way. In towns and cities, of course, there were taverns and inns which people might frequent and go for an evening's entertainment. In villages, where most of us would have lived, of course, there wasn't usually an inn or a tavern or even any kind of establishment, apart from perhaps an alehouse where you might go after dark. It seems that they used the local facilities though. So for example, we know from manorial rolls in Ely in the 13th century, a certain group of men were admonished and punished for unseemly and rowdy behaviour in the churchyard after service. So they were using the facilities they had, which was the churchyard. Obviously people met there on Sundays, so people would have been very familiar with that area. Apparently they were gambling and playing dice and generally getting drunk. So there you go, we know that that sort of thing happened. And I think it's likely most people wound down fairly quickly after a long day's physical labour. They had ale to drink, which is a form of liquid bread, is a form of extra sustenance, of course, and water. I just sat and chatted. Maybe somebody came back from the local market and had some news to share, maybe a rumour about the local lord or something going on, maybe even something big, something almost national news, the equivalent today. Maybe there was an invasion rumoured, maybe some kind of story was woven around that particular incident. Maybe it's completely untrue. In effect, it was like a form of social media. Gossiping was frowned upon, but widely pursued. So people would be exchanging stories. They might be wondering about the weather. They might be talking about how they're going to grow more herbs or what they're going to do. People speculate and people come up with stories all the time. And this is exactly what they did in medieval times. There were games you could play, Nine Man's Morris, there were dice games. There wasn't really any kind of entertainment, though, in peasant villages, to say. Towns and cities, of course, had inns and taverns and establishments you could actually visit. Now, there is some evidence that there was this double sleeping, that you would fall asleep fairly early for a few hours, then you would wake up at night and have an hour or two's sort of awake time in the middle of the night and then go back to sleep again. The evidence for that is fairly good, but I don't know how widespread it was. I think it's more likely that after a hard day's physical labour in the fields with all that fresh air and all that sunshine, you'd probably crash out for the whole of the night. You need the sleep after all. You're going to be getting up fairly early, especially in the summer. So you just want to go to sleep. Perhaps in the winter, when you're going to bed really early and not getting up till later. Maybe the winter was a time when people woke up in the middle of the night, maybe tended to the fire, maybe stoked the fire up, warmed themselves up, and then went to sleep again until the dawn. The dawn, of course, in the winter, especially in England, can be 9 o'clock in the morning. So it's quite late. In the summer, though, it can be 5 o'clock in the morning. So there's a big difference there. And your behaviour would adjust itself over the seasons. You would just naturally get used to that kind of rhythm. And then you wake up the next day and do the same thing again. Ordinary people's lives were actually quite varied. There would have been regular things. There was regular work to do. There was a regular wash day on a Monday. There was regular market day to go to. So things did vary a bit, but by and large, much like we do. You've got your job to do. You go to work, you do the job, you come back home and you eat and go to sleep. It was very similar in many ways, but a bit more outdoorsy and an awful lot more physical than most of us in the modern world, anyway, in the West. There are plenty of people who labour in the fields today, but in the West, in England these days, that's fairly rare. I think they were probably quite fit and quite healthy. That outdoor work would bronze your skin. It would keep you fit and healthy. You don't go to the gym. You don't need to, quite frankly, because you're doing physical work all the time. Men and women are doing physical work all the time. And they probably don't have as much food as they would ideally like. So they're eating large quantities of carbohydrates. They're eating large quantity of starchy foods and green and things like that. Not too much meat, but they're probably burning a lot of those calories off by just walking around, carrying water and doing all the physical things that a peasant needed to do to survive. It wasn't quite subsistence farming, but it wasn't far off, especially in the bad conditions or in famine. You were very susceptible to weather and bad diseases and crop failure. That was always on the back of your mind, I would imagine, as well, because a bad harvest would mean a hungry winter.